Excellent. Good afternoon, I guess it is, and thank you all for having me. Thanks, Mike, for inviting me. As you know, as you heard, I actually work for you all, not just you all, but I work for you all, as well as a bunch of other big academic medical centers in New York you're probably more familiar with the term FOJP maybe than HIC. It's the same program, different companies, but it's part of the same program, all owned by Maimonides, Montefiore, and Mount Sinai. Beth Israel too. Beth Israel is now part of Mount Sinai. And the company's been in existence for a long time, actually. We started by Federation of Jewish Philanthropies, some 30 years ago, and has been around for a long time. And it's only been in the last 10 years or so that the company has decided to not just deal with their core business of managing claims, malpractice claims, but actually looking at the other side, preventing things from happening, bad things from happening, which is risk management and patient safety. And that's where I sort of get involved as the chief medical officer. So I'm delighted to work with folks, a number of you in the room I work with all the time, and it's really a pleasure to work with leaders in our hospitals who are really trying to make care better. What I want to talk to you about today, I think, is a little different, and this is something that grew out of some experiences that I have had along with my counterpart in our claims department, Peter Colbert, who's the Senior Vice President for Legal Claims and Risk Management. And he and I have been teaching a course in law and medicine, for lack of a better term, at Albert Einstein for the last year and a half. And I thought it might be interesting to share with you my thoughts on how this came about teaching medical students, and to a certain degree even residents, about this whole topic of law and medicine and the intersection between the two, which I've obviously been exposed to over the last 4.5 years at HIC. In that nexus between what happens in healthcare and hospitals and then what ultimately happens, unfortunately, maybe in a courtroom. I have no disclosures. This is an interesting quote that Peter shared with me about medicine, and unfortunately, if I showed this to you 20 years ago, you might be falling off your chair, but now you're probably thinking, oh, I knew this already, since medicine really is more and more becoming like a business. But in businesses, people get sued. One of my favorite quotes from Lucian Leape, who most of you probably know, some consider the grandfather of patient safety, is this. And frankly, I'm actually, or have been, most interested in number 3. I was really involved in creating a code of mutual respect at Maimonides because I really thought it was rather horrible that physicians were in danger of losing licenses for being disrespectful. But Lucian also talks about teaching safety science and teaching in interdisciplinary teams, something that for certainly those of us my age, we never had in medical school, and I think many medical schools are really starting to look at this now, and I think that's important. This is sort of interesting if we think about it, and I suspect you all will read this slide and think this is maybe not so true anymore, but it wasn't so long ago when these kinds of things really were true, that if you look at what undergrads go through who want to go to medical school, they have to look and read through huge amounts of material. I can only remember organic chemistry, which just nearly killed me, and probably many of you in the room. I never liked chemistry to begin with. This is really ridiculous. Memorizing all this stuff and then competing to get spots in medical school. And interestingly enough, telling you all something you don't know, medical school applications do vary a lot with the economy, because medicine, despite all the things that people my age say about medicine, is still a good job. And when other jobs aren't so good, more people apply to medical school. So it's still difficult to get into medical school. My younger daughter's boyfriend's trying to get into medical school, having the toughest time in the world. He didn't apply to Sinai, otherwise I'd come back at you, but I'm getting through her all these nuances of how hard it is to get into med school these days. And then when they get to med school, at least typically the emphasis often was on rote learning, production of knowledge and memory, and they also are competing against each other for grades, honors, choice of training programs, and so forth. So one author has said in essence that collaboration for college and med students is almost like cheating when you think about what they're asked to do, which is sort of a horrible state of affairs if you're thinking about trying to get these folks to ultimately work in teams and work with others, the people they've been competing with for years. So this is a tall order. As I said, I think many of you may look at this and say, well, maybe not so true anymore. I hope you're saying that, because I think ultimately it's pretty tough to expect people to work in teams if they didn't learn in teams, and if all they got was this kind of stuff going through the process just to get to become physicians or nurses or anything else. This is some data I'm going to show you from Mount Sinai that I got a couple of years ago from Bonnie on MERS, which most of you know is the sun-setting system that really was pioneered here, I think, by Hal Kaplan. He brought it from Columbia, right? to report events. And if you look at who's reporting events, it wouldn't surprise you to know that it's not doctors. It's mostly nurses. And there's lots of reasons for that. We could spend a whole hour talking about why doctors don't report events. Those who do report, half of them are house staff, some attendings, and then some other types of folks who are sort of listed in the provider category. But there really is a problem with this. If we're really ultimately going to try and make places safer, we need to know about all the events, and not just the bad events, but the near misses. There's some great work that a colleague of ours, I think, Mike, you know, Jason Edelman did when he was at Monifer. He's now at Columbia, looking at medication errors. And if you look at the actual times that patients get the wrong medication, there's not enough of them to study. So he really wanted to look at near misses. He actually asked his EMR folks to actually look in the EMR and find out how often it was that a physician ordered a medication and then in 5 or 10 minutes DC'd that order and ordered another one, or the same medication for a different patient. And it turns out that happens tens of thousands of times, and most of the time it's residents. And they went and interviewed a whole bunch of these residents, and 80% of the time, what did they find? The resident said, I remembered that I ordered this for the wrong patient, went back, stopped it, and ordered for the right patient. Those are all near misses. And that's how he was able to study changing how you can order things in an EMR, preventing patients, doctors from having too many things open at once, or requiring them to re-enter the patient's identification, medical record number, and so forth. And by doing that, was able to drop the near misses in half, which you would hope is going to drop the real misses in half. So there's a real benefit to studying not just events, but actually near misses. Well, beyond medical school, you all know this stuff. Now, Joint Commission, along with the ACGME, has these 6 core competencies. And of course, you all know these are them. I focus just for today's purposes on the system-based practice, which really talks about safety, providing optimal health care, and these things for residents that are required to do, work in teams, coordinate patient care, incorporate considerations of cost awareness, risk benefit, and advocate for patient quality care and optimal patient care systems. So we have to think about medical students understanding this before they get to become residents and attendings, when they're going to be required to do all this stuff. And this is the stuff that I'm particularly interested in, working in interprofessional teams, enhancing safety and improved care, and then identifying errors and implementing potential system solutions. And we've seen sort of sporadically, the internal medicine group actually created a near-miss database, I think, in New York for a while. I don't know if it still exists. So there's been efforts, sporadic efforts, to try and get people who are learning about healthcare, students and residents, to start reporting things when they see them. What about teaching all this in medical schools? I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but this comes from a study from the Journal of Patient Safety just this year. Interestingly enough, it was done in UCSF this was done by the Council of Internal Medicine, which the clerkships in internal medicine is pretty much 80% of all the internal medicine clerkships around the country. They surveyed third-year medical students and asked them about safety. You can see that this was a follow-up study actually from 2006. So this was done just recently, I think in 11 or 12. And they were up to about 50% overall. In 2006, it was only 25%. So we've come a long way just in the last 5 or 6 years, but we're still only teaching half of medical students about safety. And this is sort of just gives you an idea where it's being done. Mostly in the second and third year. I guess by the fourth year, students are out and about doing sub-internships and the like, have less control. This is a little hard to see, but just to show you here the difference between the light shades and the dark shades. The light shades tell you what percentage of the program think these things should be taught. The dark shades are actually when they're taught. So they think they should be taught twice as much as they actually are. All these things, and I'm most interested in these, understanding and learning from errors. So maybe 30% are actually being done, 70% think it should be. Understanding and managing clinical risk, again, almost 50% think it should be taught, but it's only being taught in 20%. Human factors engineering, which I really think is something that we really ought to be focusing on, they only 30 or 40% thought it should be taught, and maybe 10% are actually teaching this stuff. So we still have a long way to go in trying to get medical students information about patient safety. What about malpractice? This one comes from UCSF. I'm confusing the two. This comes from UCSF, which is sort of interesting, and I'll tell you about why that is in a minute. And they asked medical students about their views. It really was a study to look at defensive medicine, but it ended up being a lot about malpractice as well. So they asked med students, are they worried about this? And most of them are not. However, the people they're learning from, half of them are. Half of the attendings and maybe a little less of the residents are concerned about malpractice. But they do believe, medical students even, that their satisfaction will, about half of them thought it'd be affected by their concerns about lawsuits, which is interesting. Now, why is it so interesting to think that this is in California? What the authors did say is California has caps, right? So lawsuits aren't, if you think about defensive medicine and worrying about costs, the cost of malpractice cases in California is very different, certainly than it is in New York. Mike and Chris, who I work with a lot, know that we've said this a million times. Malpractice is very state-based. It's really eye-opening how state-based it is. To give you an example, Massachusetts has a charitable immunity law. So you can't sue a hospital in Massachusetts for more than $100,000. So what practically that means in a lawsuit, they name everybody so they can do the discovery and get the documents from the hospital, and then they drop the hospitals and go after the doctors. Doctors have $5 million policy limits. In New York State, no such charitable immunity law, and certainly never would have been with the former leadership in the state. We'll leave that alone. Now maybe there would be, but there isn't. And our hospitals have $10 million limits. Doctors have $2.3 million. So the hospitals are the deep pockets, and that's where the plaintiff's attorneys go. And that really influences what kinds of cases get taken, how far they go, whether they're willing to settle. It's just amazing, and it is very different. New Jersey's more like, it turns out, Massachusetts than New York. I have no idea what Connecticut's like, but every state is different. You think we have problems with physician licensing? Start thinking about malpractice laws. I mean, it's just mind-boggling how different it is. So I think we have to sort of take that. I suspect this may be understating it because we're looking in California where there are caps and things are a little different. I suspect in New York, the medical students may feel more of an influence about malpractice than they do in a state like California, but who knows? You all probably know about T4Q, which is this program that the AAMC started, Teaching for Quality. And really, I thought this was kind of interesting. This really focused on the faculty. You can't expect to teach medical students unless the faculty have competency in understanding patient safety. This is their vision. You know, I always like a vision that starts out with, it's 2022. I mean, that's really a vision, right? What are we looking for? Where that hospitals and medical schools are successfully leading enormous changes in healthcare, aided by all of these QI and patient safety efforts. These really are the competencies they thought. These are competencies for faculty. So you look at this list and you say, how are we going to teach this stuff to medical students and even residents if our faculty don't have this stuff? And now I don't have as much of a grasp on the faculty in med schools as you all do, but I would be challenged to think that a lot of the faculty have all this stuff. This is really a pretty complete list of all the things that somebody who's going to be teaching medical students about safety and quality really ought to have, and it's a pretty extensive list. I love this one, being a surgeon. I guess I could say a lot of my colleagues really have trouble with this particular bullet point. Maybe not, maybe it's getting better. So, and again, systems, adapting to systems and settings, and traditionally this is not the kind of thing that physicians were typically good at. I think things are changing, but we can't expect to teach this unless we have these competencies ourselves. Well, how do you do this teaching? I've been sort of impressed with the fact that the old style of lecturing just doesn't work anymore for anybody, which is kind of crazy because I'm standing here lecturing to you. I feel sort of bad. Actually, a couple of days ago I thought about it. I usually throw in some audience polling or videos just to spice things up a bit, but I figure you're an educational group, so maybe you just want the standard old stuff. But students don't like this. You talk to med students, they don't go to class anymore. They just, that's my sense. Who wants to wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning when they can either somebody get the notes from somebody or now just watch it all on YouTube? It's all on video. So I'm sure you all have already looked into this kind of thing. We need to change how we teach, certainly to medical students who are my kids' age, dare I say, and they're not interested in hearing a talking head. They're just not. So there's loads of ways to do this, case studies with interactive discussions, role play, docudrama, I like that. New York, that must be a lot of fun. Independent study modules, practice-based learning and improvement exercise. I'm sure you're all familiar with this stuff. I'm most interested in these bottom two, simulations and simulators. You heard in my bio that we really work a lot with our hospitals on simulation. I think simulation is really an exciting way of engaging learners of any sort from med school on up. And one of the things we're focusing on actually is using simulation for attendings, because I think many attendings don't really see simulation as a tool for continuing practice. They see it as a training tool, but we actually see it as a safety tool. So I think simulation is a great way of doing it. It's exciting, it's interactive, and it's in many cases real life. And then team-based learning, not just with themselves as students, but also with other professionals. Team-based learning with nursing students, allied health professionals. So people who are learning to be physicians actually learn how to learn in teams. It's much easier to work in teams if you're learning in teams. So Peter and I, when we sort of designed this course that we teach at Einstein, we decided we'd use a team-based learning approach. And that's what I want to tell you a little bit about. Now, this is a very complicated slide on purpose. The path to a lawsuit is very complicated. I mean, this is sort of homegrown. I kind of put this together just sort of to help me think more clearly about it. Just following the red boxes, you know, something bad happens. And as soon as that happens, two things: risk management gets notified, and hopefully someone's talking to the patient and the family about what has happened. And then there's an internal investigation, you hope, that could involve a peer review or maybe a root cause analysis or both, depending on how bad it is. And risk management's obviously involved in that. They may call us. We get these alerts to tell us that something bad happened. This may become a lawsuit, and we'll start doing our own investigation. And of course, you hope after the internal investigation, you want to let the family know what has happened. At least we think that's the right thing to do. And then you get down to what happens next, depending on how bad it is and who's involved. There may be a corrective action plan. You may have to report it to somebody, the state, CMS, Joint Commission. You could probably add a couple more down here, I guess. And sometimes the quality improvement folks, most places actually it's risk management that does the reporting, depends. But certainly the quality improvement folks are involved with this corrective action plan to try and make sure things don't happen again. And then you've got this whole range of things that I'll talk about in a minute of what you do as a corrective action plan. And the hope is you let the family know again, what the patient and family know what you've decided to do to prevent this from happening again. I think that's important. And then you get your safety folks involved with this too. And then finally, there may or may not be a lawsuit. And the lawsuit can either lead to a trial, it could be dropped or dismissed, or there could be a settlement. So this is sort of the path. And the reason I show you this is, I think this has sort of formed the core of what Peter and I are trying to do for students. We're trying to give them this path, to show them that an adverse event doesn't exist in a vacuum, that there's all sorts of things that go along with it, that you as a student and ultimately a physician should know about, including what happens if there's a lawsuit, how to protect yourself, protect your hospital, protect your patients. And there really is a continuum. So I think the course we've designed really addresses that whole continuum. I think if you put this in context, it's probably easier for students to understand. Otherwise, any one piece of this can look very confusing, and out of context, sometimes it's hard to get, well, what difference does that make? So if we put it all together, I think it makes more sense, and I'll show you how we do that. This is one of my favorite slides that I show at any talk I give around safety. Those of you who have ever been to a root cause analysis, I would venture to say that most of you come out of that room and all you hear about is this kind of stuff. More training, more procedures and policies, warning labels, telling people to work harder, and so forth. And the fact is, none of that stuff really works very well. We know it, and yet we continue to beat ourselves on the head to do this stuff. These are the things on the top, these system designs, system changes that are really going to make a difference in preventing bad things from happening again, not more training. So this is the kind of thing that we sort of emphasize in this course. This actually, the teaching this course has caused me to think about our role as your insurer and what we do, and I kind of came up with the 4 Ps, just easy to remember. So bear with me for a second. In the first instance, all of us are looking to prevent adverse events, right? We don't want bad things to happen. Now we know the literature seems to suggest that overall, globally, we can prevent about half of the adverse events that occur in hospitals. Now, depending on what you're looking at, it may be more, it may be less, but it's about half. So we just, no matter what we do, we're not going to prevent all of them. And if we can't, we ought to try and preclude a malpractice case. So how do we do that? Most of the precluding malpractice case part is in communication, right? I think all of you are familiar with the literature that shows physicians and providers, nurses and allied health professionals involved in the same kind of case. One there's a lawsuit, one there isn't. Most of that is around how we communicate this to patients and families, what we tell them, how upfront we are with them, Most physicians, certainly surgeons, when you have a bad complication, your instinct is to kind of run away, and it should be the opposite. See the patients more often than you normally would. Document all of it. It's the communication that really keeps patients engaged, and it doesn't always work, but it's less likely that you'll end up being in a lawsuit. So, but sometimes we can't. We do live in New York City. People sue for all sorts of crazy reasons, and when they do, we want to prevail in a lawsuit. And we do that really mostly by documentation. I don't want to speak for my colleagues on the other side of our company, but those of you who have worked with them know that's really what they're focusing on so much of the time. It's how we document what we do. Documenting what you did for a patient, the conversations you had with other physicians and so forth. And then, of course, ultimately it's about protecting healthcare providers. And traditionally, those of us in risk management are working on this stuff, preventing events and preventing malpractice cases with communication. And the claims and litigation folks get involved in the end. And those of you who are working with us now know that we've really come to do this together. And that's why I think it's kind of nice that Peter and I, both representing the two sides of this, really teach this course together to medical students so they know that doctors and lawyers aren't the enemy. There's all sorts of names that many doctors have called lawyers, but I think it helps that we present a unified front, that here we are, physicians and attorneys working together to help make care better, because they really all is integrated. So I suspect, how many of you, don't have my audience polling, but I'll do a quick one. How many of you are familiar with team-based learning? Excellent, most of you. Perfect, so this will be quick. I really was, when I first heard about this at my alma mater at Duke, they do this for a lot of their classes, and I thought it was a really great way of keeping students engaged to really stop this whole talking head thing. So this is the design, you're all familiar with this, but I'll tell you how we've done this in teaching medical students about this whole topic of law and medicine. So the preparation is 8 short articles. I'll tell you exactly what we use. We do a readiness assurance test. It's 10 multiple choice questions. And then we do the group assessment test. We actually use these things you're probably familiar with, these scratch-off cards, right, that actually have the answers underneath them. So the teams each group gets a card and they scratch it off and they're looking for the star. It's kind of like a lottery thing. It's kind of fun, especially today. That might be kind of interesting. In fact, no, sorry. So that's a little tool that we use with that. And then we spend about 15 to 20 minutes going over the difficult questions. There's a little short PowerPoint we have to try and address some of those things. And then the second hour, it's a 2-hour course. So the first hour is around this individual readiness assessment, the group readiness assessment, and then some review of that. And then the second hour is actually a group application exercise, and it's a real case that we have them work on together in groups. These are the articles we use. This is an article from ASHRM, the American Society of Healthcare Risk Management, which is really the national organization for risk managers. They have a nice article that looks at what the difference between risk and quality is, something that I always found confusing. We work with a lot of different hospitals, and depending on the size of the hospitals, the people in risk and quality can be the same, or they can be in different departments. Just depends on how big you are. And the safety folks too. There's like 3 of them that really there's a lot of overlap, but it's confusing to people, and I think this really helps separate exactly what their different roles are. This is an article about adverse events. It's really just a news article more than anything else, so it's an easy read about why doctors aren't reporting events. I think that's kind of important. You'll see we'll ask questions about that. This is an article about the payment system in medical malpractice litigation, about how much is spent on just paying lawyers and the whole system rather than actually going to patients. And then finally, those of you who know the name Michelle Mello, Mike, you know Michelle Mello, who's now at Stanford. She was in Boston. She's a big writer, she's an attorney, writes a lot about healthcare law, really about disclosure and resolution programs that actually a bunch of our hospitals were involved with a number of years ago through an ARC grant. This is the article, I think, that was based on that. Well, it's probably not, because it's 2012. I think the article came out after that, right? And I can maybe in 14. But it talks about what the issues are with disclosure and resolution. And again, state laws really have an impact on this. There's a difference between apologizing and telling people you're sorry. Telling people you're sorry that something happened doesn't necessarily imply that you had a role in it. Apologizing for doing something really implies that you may have had a role of it, and there are different laws in each state that won't admit apologies, and some will. It's very confusing, and unless you know the law, you can sort of get yourself you can say things that with all good intent that could be sort of used against you. So it's important to understand this stuff. And then the question is, what do patients think about all this? Think about yourselves. I mean, the beauty of healthcare is we're all patients, for better or for worse, at some point or another. What would you think if somebody came to you and wanted to disclose something to you and offered you compensation? how would that change your view of your physician or your healthcare team? So they talk about some of these issues. And then Peter writes these things. How many people have heard of the tip of the month? There are some clinicians in here. You should get this. If you don't, let me know afterwards. We'll put you on the mailing list. So Peter writes, they're very short. There may be, a couple of paragraphs. Interesting tidbits about different aspects of the legal side of medicine, using social media and what the dangers are and documentation and what happens when you want to discharge a patient who you feel like you want to end the doctor-patient relationship, how to do that, closing a practice and so forth. So we include a bunch of those too, which goes over some of the legal sides of all this. So this is one of the questions from our readiness assessment tests. See how you do with this. What's the most likely reason for physician reticence to report adverse events? Is it misunderstanding of what an adverse event is? Is it inadequate training on use of hospital adverse event reporting systems? Is it the fear of liability and malpractice suits? Or is it just reliance on other healthcare professionals like nurses and risk managers to report? What do you think? How many people would say it's misunderstanding of what an adverse event is? None of you. Inadequate training on use of the system? Hello? All right, you're waiting for this one. Fear of liability and malpractice suits. There we go. All right, about half of you. And how about reliance on other health professionals? Excellent. Well, it turns out most of it is this, misunderstanding of what an adverse event is. You ask most physicians what an adverse event is, they don't really know. Typical example from a surgical world, Mike, right? You ask a physician if a superficial wound infection after a hernia repair is an adverse event. No, it's a complication. It happens. They don't view it as first of all, the word adverse event has certain connotations to it. It's like admitting defeat. So, teaching physicians that an adverse event, what an adverse event is critical, because if they don't know what it is, it's kind of hard to get them to report them. Even harder to report near misses where nothing ever happens to the patient, right? So this is kind of important, and this is covered in some of the reading. Here's another question for you to consider. While treating a patient, a physician realizes that the patient has unrealistic expectations, will not be satisfied with the care that the doctor is providing. The physician should, A, stop treating the patient, B, try to educate the patient and add a note to the patient's chart, C, stop treating the patient and provide the names of several colleagues to the patient, or D, call risk management. Okay, so how many of you think it's A, stop treating the patient? B, try to educate and add a note to the chart. Most of you. Stop treating the patient, give them the names of a couple of colleagues. Anybody? No takers? Call risk management? Not a bad idea. Actually, it's probably B, so you all pretty much got that. But I don't, depending on where you are, if you're in an office, who are you going to call? There's no risk management to call. I guess you can call your malpractice carrier, which is sort of the same idea. But you really want to talk to the patient, add a note. It may be that you get to the point where you have to do C, but that's you really have to give patients a chance to understand that you're really having difficulty with what they're expecting and what you're trying to recommend. And at some point, it's okay to end the doctor-patient relationship, but there are ways to do that. And that may involve something in that answer. So these are just 2 of the 10 questions we give. So then we get to this group application exercise, and some of you may sort of sound familiar with this kind of case. An elderly non-diabetic mistakenly gets 2 doses of an oral hypoglycemic. Bad things happen when you do that. And the patient has a seizure, probably a seizure, an acute mental status change, and ends up in an ICU. Actually, the patient ultimately died. This is an actual case. And so we use it. It's already been closed, so it's okay to do. And of course, there's no names or anything. We add a couple of interesting twists to it that probably aren't so real, like the patient's 2 kids who happen to be a police officer and a nurse. I mean, can you imagine? Approach the doctor, and we tell the students that they are now the resident that ordered the medication by mistake, and they're now walking down the hall, and here's the family coming at them, right? So we ask them, what's the very first thing you do? And of course, the answer can't be, excuse me, I have to go to the bathroom. Having the runs, got to go. They have to actually interact with the family, a police officer and a nurse, right? So that's pretty daunting. So we ask them to actually write out on a board what they're actually going to say to the family. Then what do they do next in a progress note? It's amazing. They get caught up a little bit. Is this a transfer note? Is it a follow-up note? They don't know how to title the note. I said, don't worry about what you title the note. Just write a note and write what you'd write in the actual note. And they write the note on the board. What was the hospital response to this be? And what recommendations you would make to prevent this from happening again. So you see, we're taking them through that sequence of what happens after there's an adverse event. And then the second part of the question is, okay, now there's a lawsuit. Everybody gets named. Do you think everybody should be named? And we put the following. You have the resident who ordered the medication, the residents attending, the pharmacist and the nurse and the hospital. Should they all be, we talk to them about the ability for attorneys to have certain members, certain people named in a suit be released, be dismissed. Are any of these, would you recommend that any of these be dismissed or not? If not, why? And what would the impact actually be on these different people and parties, hospital and so forth? Should there actually be a lawsuit and a settlement? So it gets them to start thinking about what's going to happen to reputations and the PR and all this other stuff around it. So it really, as you know, it's a group application exercise. So they're working in teams. And then we sort of do one of these walk-around storyboard things. They're on big whiteboards, and usually there's 2 or 3 groups. And we ask them to go look at each other's and then, rate which one they like the best. And of course, most of them rate their own, but not always. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes they'll kind of rate the others as being a better answer than theirs. The most interesting part to me is this piece here. Some of them actually go as far as to say, I'll go into a quiet place, which is great because you don't want to start having these kinds of conversations in the hallways. What are you actually writing in the progress note? And there's no right answer. Are you going to actually fall on your sword in the progress note and say, I ordered the wrong medication by mistake and the patient had a seizure? And some of the students take it a little bit personally. I guess they should. That's probably appropriate. But we try to emphasize the fact that the patient got the wrong medication. Even though you ordered it, is that entirely your responsibility? And the answer, of course, is no. This is a system failure, a true system failure. So we ask them, okay, so what are the 3 general parts of getting a patient a medication? Somebody has to order it. Who's that? The physician. Somebody has to fill it. Who's that? Pharmacist. Somebody actually has to give it to the patient. Who's that? The nurse. And within each of those is 4 or 5 steps. So talk about the Swiss cheese model, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. All the holes are lining up here. So just because you ordered the wrong medication doesn't mean you're the only one responsible for this. The pharmacist failed you, the nurses failed you, everybody failed. And that's why this patient got the wrong medication. So it's, especially at the beginning, it's not so clear that you need to write, I gave the wrong patient the patient the wrong medication, and as a result the patient has had a seizure. Be factual. You want to make sure that anybody reading the chart will see exactly what it is you did. A lot of them actually forget to document that they spoke to the family. Well, that's important. You want to write that down. We spoke to the family, informed them, told them we're going to follow up with them and tell them exactly what the results of our investigation are. This shouldn't have happened, and so forth. So that's kind of how it goes. I thought you might be interested to know what the students thought of this. And this is the fascinating part. For me, I can't say like you all that I'm really an educator, although I enjoy teaching. I'm not primarily an educator. But this really, I was sort of felt somewhat professorial, kind of an interesting side note. I do have an appointment here at Mount Sinai, one that you probably have never heard of before, that the Department of Surgery came up for me. I'm a professorial lecturer in the Department of Surgery. How do you like that? Sounds pretty exotic, doesn't it? Professorial lecturer. Who even knew there was such a category? I think they made it up for me. They probably did. Anyway, I'm the first and only. So as a professorial lecturer, I can tell you, these are what the students thought about it. And now what's interesting is, at Einstein, they changed, well, you probably know this, there are different types of evaluations depending on the type of class that the student is taking. So for this first year, it was just sort of a standard evaluation. There were really just 3 questions, 2 sort of multiple choice and 1 open-ended. First question, what was the effectiveness in allowing you to achieve its objectives? And you can see that most of them thought it was effective or very effective. Well, that's good. And whether this was delivered at an appropriate level for you as a 4th-year medical students. We do this actually, the students at Einstein get this in their ambulatory rotation. And they could be anywhere. Some of them go to Maimonides, some of them are actually overseas, they may or may not be able to come. So every month there's a group of students on an ambulatory rotation, and they have what's called a Population Health Management Day on a Friday once a month, where our program, Peter and I program, and then a couple of other folks teaching about coding, CPT coding, and so forth, talk to these 4th-year medical students. So we have a different group every month, anywhere between 6 to 20. The last one we did in November, they were off in December. Everybody was interviewing. We literally had 4 people. It was a little ridiculous, more instructors than kids, but it was all right. They got one-on-one lecturing from the professorial lecturer. So it varies, but it's usually a small group. I think we have the next one in January. There are 15 or so there'll be probably 3 groups of 5. So they're 4th-year medical students. Well, this is the kind of the interesting part I thought you might like. What went well? What did you learn? How could it be improved? So I took some random quotes. Extremely useful, eye-opening introduction to a topic we always hear about but never learn about. Okay, that's not bad. Very informative session with real case examples. The team-based learning approach worked well for the topic. Nice. A lot of talking points that were practically speaking inapplicable in the real world. Well, that's nice. But I suppose being that the speakers were not physicians, you can't hold them to that. So I obviously did a horrible job of letting them know that I actually was a doctor. And you know, people who know me, it's hard to believe. Because at the beginning, you know, there's a slide, David Feldman, MD, you know, David Feldman, plastic surgeon, but apparently they must have been snoozing for that part. I don't know, but I guess they saw me as a lawyer, so what can you do? How about these? A lot of bad news at once. Well, I guess it can be kind of depressing. Now this is the good part. You'll enjoy this. I did the reading in its entirety, did not do well on the quiz, and still felt that I got yelled at under the category of nobody here did the reading. So Peter, my colleague in claims, got a little, you know, one day he was just so fed up with the fact that they clearly weren't reading any of this stuff. I guess somebody perceived that he was yelling at them about not doing the reading, and even though he did and didn't do too well on the quiz, you know, they're students. What can you do? I thought this session would have been improved if there had been an actual didactic aspect. The session was almost entirely TBL without any background or strong take-home points at the end. So I will tell you, at the end of the first year, Peter and I were ready to either stop or do something different. And somebody in the dean's office said to us, look, the only way they're going to read is if you grade it. Then they will read it. So the dean approved grading the session. You had to just pass-fail. You now have to pass this session to get your grade in ambulatory health. Big difference. Now they started reading. But now, of course, they were picky with every question, and he predicted this. You know, this word reticence, what does that mean? You know, it was really unbelievable. The dramatic change from the first year to the second when all of a sudden it was graded. So these are the scores. I thought you'd get a kick out of seeing the scores. Now remember, there's a readiness assessment, the IRAT, individual readiness assessment scores, and the GRAT, the group readiness assessment. So the first thing you see, the blue ones are for year one. These are the group scores for year one, group scores for individual scores for year one. The purple are the scores for year two. And you can see we're still in the middle of year two, so that doesn't go to the end. But there's a pattern already. First thing you notice is groups always do better than individuals. Would that surprise anybody? No. What's more interesting is we did a little deep dive on the data in the first year. Not only did the groups do better than the individuals, but if you look at the people who score the highest on the individual scores, they weren't necessarily the ones in the highest group scores. So you couldn't predict group results by individual results. It wasn't that the group scores that did the best were made up of the people that did the individual scores the best. It's all group dynamics. I'm not telling you something you don't know because you're all familiar with TBL. But it's fascinating stuff. So there was that. Clearly, when you had them read, they did better. I mean, it was dramatic. The first session we did in June, when they all of a sudden had to read it, Peter and I looked at each other like, oh my God, this is like a different class. And you know, it's a Friday afternoon. Some of them are, you know, little, postprandial. We just had lunch, whatever it is. So getting them more interested in this stuff was easier when they had read it. So it was so much better. So here it is. You know, group scoring is always better than individual. The higher group scoring is not predicted by group member individual scores. And again, unless the class is graded and students must pass, the pre-reading will not be done. And they complained bitterly about how much reading it was. It may have been, I don't know, 45 or 50 pages, but it was easy, fairly easy reading, and we tried to make them little bits and pieces of things so they could read a little bit here, read a little bit there. They just keep complaining bitterly about it. And of course, as you know, since they're only doing it 20 students at a time at most, you can't change anything in the middle of the year because it's not fair to the students who had it first and not. So once you set out on this, the year has to stay the same. But it really is different. Now, we have to have a makeup, like what happens if they fail? So we basically created a case. They had to write a one-page essay. And I have to tell you, this is the most rewarding thing for us to read. We started reading these makeup tests because they started panicking. What happened if I fail? You know, the whole thing, they're doing the math in their head. I got 39 points. Oh, my God. Don't worry about it. You know, and I kind of feel bad. I'm really not an educator per se, but here these poor students are thinking about this. Reminded me of college when I taught a house course at Duke. They used to have these courses that you could teach as a student. You'd have a faculty advisor. And I taught a course in electronic music. Why? I don't know. I had an interest in it. And luck for me, 3 football players were in my course and told me they needed it to graduate. I mean, really? Anyway, so back to this story. So we have a makeup test. And it's an essay. It's a one-page essay. And reading these things, it's like, wow. They really got it because it's free text. They talk about what they're going to do, and basically it's just another case like the group application exercise, a bad outcome, so who needs to be notified, who are you going to call, what do you do next, What are the corrective actions? How would you fix this? Who needs to be reported? Who needs to be reported to the data bank, National Practitioner Data Bank? And you look at this and go, they really learned something. I mean, it's very gratifying. So I actually kind of like it when they fail, because then we get to really see what they really are thinking about. So again, this is sort of our hospital system. All the Sinai hospitals, I don't have to tell you about this. The list keeps getting longer. Montefiore probably has just as many. They just don't categorize it that way. This actually is 3 hospitals. This is 2. There's them here. They have a medical school also. And then little old Maimonides, who may end up with Northwell at some point. And Bronx Lab is actually an insured hospital, but they're not owners. So we do some work with them too. What time is it? 1:15. So I'm done. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Hope I've sort of enlightened you about how, sort of our view on teaching med students about this kind of stuff. There's a lot of work to do, and happy to answer any questions you have.